Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to another episode of LangBytes, your podcast about computational linguistics. And in today's in today's episode, we have the honor of talking to Ezra Winsgrove. I'm sorry, I forgot your last name again. Uh, Winsgrove Grant. Is that correct? Can you say your last name again, please?
Sure. It's Wyschogrod.
Wyschogrod.
Yep.
Ezra Wyschogrod. Great. So Ezra is a language engineer at Amazon Alexa, focusing on entertainment, including music, video, and sport requests from customers. His work spans natural language understanding and automatic speech recognition, and he holds a bachelor's in linguistics from Columbia University and a master's degree in linguistics from Georgetown. So a very fancy resume. Um, so again, thank you, Ezra, for coming. Thank you for accepting, and I'm sure we are going to learn a lot from you.
And thank you so much for having me, Joao Victor. Always excited to talk about professional linguistics when I can.
Great, great. Um, so as customary here in the podcast, we have first our random question, which is a little bit personal to the guest. And your random question is, which weather do you prefer, cold or warm, and why?
Mm. So it's interesting. I would actually have to say cold. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think number one, I actually grew up here in New England, and I definitely skied a lot when I was growing up. So I love that. A lot of snow, really into it. And I think additionally, when one lives in sort of a four-season city, you really, really end up appreciating summer in a way that you don't in kind of cities that have more consistent temperatures. And I remember thinking that when I was visiting UC San Diego as part of grad school visits, where I went there, I think in the middle of February, and I noticed, wow, it's really like 30 degrees centigrade here in February. I feel like it would be weird to not have seasons. So definitely a cold weather guy. But as it so happens, it's actually unseasonably warm here in Boston in October.
Great. I'm a cold weather guy as well. I don't like um, hot weather, but I was born in Brazil, so not so good for me.
Right.
Great. Thank you for that. Now we are going to move on to, let's say, the more serious questions, and then we can make it as fluid as possible, or we can make it as an interview. It doesn't matter. Um, so the first question we would like to talk about the beginning of your career. So your career journey has taken you from academia, right, from doing a bachelor's and a master's to the industry now with your Amazon role.
Mhm.
So can you share the key factors or decisions that influence your transition into the technology sector, and how has your academic background in linguistics informed your career choices?
So in my transition from, I would call it brief foray in academia. As a little bit of background, I have that undergraduate degree from Columbia, and then I spent some time in a PhD program in Georgetown before what we call mastering out, so leaving after the master's. In time, I had spent some time going to conferences and working on some publications of sociophonetic nature. But for me, the sort of impetus for that transition was lifestyle factors. Um, I think it kind of can be split sort of in two different factors. It's getting a job and that whole treadmill, as well as even when you have a job, what one does in academia every day.
Mhm.
And I'd say that the amount of stuff that one must go through to get sort of a reliable role in academia is pretty treacherous. I know it's been talked about in previous episodes here, but personally, I think less willing to spend a pretty large portion of the earlier third of my life going into finishing the PhD, doing probably multiple postdocs, having limited geographical flexibility, more permanent role, all of that was, I think, was something I didn't love. And I was in my mid-20s when thinking about this, and I knew it could be, 5, 10, maybe even 15 years before finding that, tenure track role. So I was less willing to do that. And then additionally, there's the incentive structure, at least as I perceived it. And for me, what kind of spooked me is that in a way of looking at it, in academia, it's never really enough. I always felt that way, where basically it's always better to have more publications. It is always better to kind of, do larger and larger research projects. And the sort of stopping mechanism every single day wasn't really there for me, where I would definitely be doing better if I would be working till 9 p.m. instead of 7 p.m. Meanwhile, at least as I've experienced in industry, 5:30, you go home. And to me, that makes all the difference mental health wise, spiritually. I think it's incredible. So noticing that, looking out from academia to industry, I think that was a really big impetus as well.
Yeah, I agree. I remember your participation on the Linguistic Career Cast, and you said something similar to that. And I remember you mentioned you had a colleague that was super smart, but she wasn't getting any job in academia.
Yeah.
So basically saying that even if you're a genius in your field, maybe you won't get the job that you wanted in academia, at least. That's a shame.
Yeah, that can definitely be the case. It's it can be sad sometimes, a little disheartening. Now looking at the opposite end, looking back into academia, where thankfully I have had former colleagues that have gotten awesome roles, are thrilled, and they're teaching in a tenure track position. But I think much more so, it's those that are sort of on that treadmill of doing a bunch of postdocs, sort of teaching gigs that are not necessarily what they expected, those sort of things. I'm still on the younger side, and as are many of the people who I worked with in graduate school. So time may tell, but for a lot of folks, it's a grind, and that is definitely I think that probably has always been the case of academia, but it's certainly the case now.
Yeah, that's sad, unfortunately. But now let's talk a little bit about your experience in the industry. So as a language engineer and probably during your time in Georgetown, you've acquired a diverse set of technical skills, including programming languages, as well as linguistic tools, I imagine. So how have these skills been instrumental in shaping your career, and which ones do you consider most essentials for linguists entering the field today?
So I get this question actually quite frequently, and often sort of when two people in my social life will put me with another linguist to sort of give advice. I kind of answer it this way, where in terms of technical skills like Python, R, C++, things like that, I always felt that if you're really a linguist in tech, you often use those things as very useful means to an end, although not necessarily deliverables themselves. They help with the deliverable, they're not necessarily the deliverable. I think once you get to the point where it becomes your deliverable, you become more of a not quite computational linguist, you become more onto the programming machine learning end, which is also lovely and also great. Although I view that to be a bit different in terms of role. But that's sort of, I would say, globally how I use, Python, R, things of that nature. But I always tend to use them sort of as means. In terms of, I think, which technical skills are most useful, I think before even talking about, Python or R, it's actually stats. And I think that is, whether I think people realize it or not, I think that's the case in many roles, including in academia and linguistics as well. I think the ability to interpret outliers, the ability to understand different metrics within stats, mean, standard deviation, effect size, which ultimately are kind of basic things, but tremendously important. that is the most important skill. I spend my whole day reading. That's the Amazon life. We're a doc reading culture, and there's stats everywhere. That's number one. And I would say I got that from taking courses in statistics in undergrad and grad. It was part and parcel of both linguistics departments that I was a part of, and I'm very grateful for that. As far as sort of the nuts and bolts programming languages stuff, I found Python to be the most critical, without question, relative to other computer languages in Amazon and in my previous role after academia. No question about it. I think the high level programming languages like Python are absolutely critical if you're picking one. I think R has been useful for me in sort of like side projects. If I have a piece of data I might want to interpret for work or even on my own, I might use R. But I think Python has been critical. I think R has been long-term useful for me more as a vehicle with which to understand stats better per, the beginning part of the answer. I think those have been incredibly critical. And I think beyond that, for technical skills, I think an odd one I think I'll bring up is actually use of Stack Exchange, oddly enough. Because I think based on your reaction, Joao Victor, I think you know what I'm talking about here, that basically if you have a programming question, often you can't be bothering, your other colleagues that have a million things to do as well. You jump on Stack Exchange and someone back in 2011 answered your question and you feel like it's an oracle.
Mm.
So that's kind of my day-to-day on, the technical skills that have actually translated.
Yeah. That's interesting. That you said statistics, it caught my attention because previously I talked with other linguists and people from Brazil as well.
Mm-hmm.
They usually mention programming languages first. And now that you mentioned statistics, it makes sense to learn statistics first because then you use the programming languages to calculate the statistics that you want. So interesting. Um, and do you believe that the statistics, at least for linguists, should be taught or should be learned during undergrad, during grad school, or as a minor or in a side project?
I'll give a bit of a cheeky answer, but it is really my answer. I think the answer is middle and high school. I think I'll just answer on behalf of the United States, particularly Massachusetts. I don't think we take stat education seriously enough, and I think it's important for everybody. Everybody who reads stats, statistical finding in a newspaper, sees it on TV, you have to be able to interpret it. And I think linguists, at least in the United States, fall victim to bad stats education a lot. So I think as early as possible. I think for sort of more linguistically targeted questions that are stat related, I would say as early as possible again. And to me, if you can have a stat, R sort of course earlier in linguistics career, I'd recommend it. And frankly, we didn't have that at Columbia, only very ancillarily. I actually got that from Linguistic Society of America summer program at Wyschogrod, which was, I think, already several years ago at the Summer Institute, where there was a quick course. I think it was Stefan Gries, if I'm remembering correctly, but his name is so large in the linguistic stat world that it could just be his name that's coming first. But I had taken a course there, learned how to use R, learned about effect size, which is really important to me. And I was able to get that. And I think for linguists, as early as possible, having a stat approach to your linguistics research or linguistics role in the professional world, critical. So I think if there's going to be any takeaway from this, from those who listen, I would say, I'm not telling you to run and go get a PhD in statistics, but I would say have a basic knowledge of Bayesian statistics, general stat knowledge, be it even things like quartiles, mean, like median, those sort of things. You want to be able to have a grasp of it. And I think there are some that might listen to this and say, of course, doesn't everyone kind of have that? But I think not everyone really has that in front of their mind. when they're doing linguistics research. So that's sort of like the soapbox that I had been on in the past couple of years.
Great. And even if you know how to do statistics, it doesn't mean that you know how to do statistics in linguistics, because they are very different.
Absolutely.
For example, if you're dealing only with numerical data from, I don't know, from a bank, it's very different if you're dealing with conversational analysis, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, the amount of linguistics analyses that would probably benefit from some kind of regression analysis, massive. But anyway, I don't want to I don't want to completely derail.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Very
Sure.
good. Now I would like to focus a little bit more on your role at Amazon Alexa. So you are a language engineer, which for me is a very awkward name, let's say, because like you will be like a linguistics engineer. Even in Portuguese, when you translate to Portuguese, is even weirder, let's say. So that's interesting. So you've been involved in the development of NLP components in the projects at Amazon. So could you walk us through a typical project from conception to implementation and how your linguistic skill set plays a crucial role in this process? So basically, how do you apply your technical knowledge of linguistics in your current role?
Yeah, so first of all, strong agree on linguist and tech having odd job titles. So before this, it was knowledge engineer, which is probably one of those just vague job titles you could have. It sounds like nothing. Um, and language engineer as well. I think they haven't figured out how to name linguists in tech because a lot of these jobs are under 10 years old. So yeah, it's odd. And when I'm in a more general crowd of non-linguists and tell them what I do, it does take a couple of sentences. But I think at Alexa, actually, I'm gonna pause my device. Anyway, at Alexa, we often get very, very vague assignments that we have to concretize. And this is something that I understand is the case in Amazon, in a lot of other major tech companies, be it Google or Facebook. And one example I have of that is not long after joining Amazon, I got essentially the assignment of people want to use social media on Fire TVs. Go make that happen. They didn't tell me, how are they going to do it? Not even what kind of videos not even how the videos are going to be presented on the screen. Not even are there particular influencers that want to be prioritized. Just people want to use Instagram, people want to use Facebook Watch, people want to use TikTok on Fire TV and other screen devices. Go for it. And that means that you have to analyze and figure out what the utterance space might be. How are people going to talk to Alexa? Even something like play TikTok videos of blank versus play blank TikTok videos. Is it going to be one or the other? And if so, do we modify the machine learning algorithms towards one or towards the other? Are people going to use the word hashtag when they ask these requests? Unclear. And we have the best methods that we can in terms of how we figure that out. There's existing customer traffic, but not a lot of people use it because it didn't work well before. That's why I had the assignment. And then additionally, we can have some level of experimentation that we do in our labs in Boston, where we gather certain, internal members of our team, give them a television and sort of ask them, some questions about how they might interact. That's the best we can do. In addition to that, you have to ask questions of how are things going to get labeled internally? What information is necessary to pass to computer science folks? What signals are we going to need to know for proper usage? Do we need screen context? Is there going to be a significant text-to-speech element to this and not just speaking to the device? All these questions had to be asked, and in doing so, I create utterances that should work. Utterances that should work to a very high degree of accuracy, to a less high degree of accuracy. I speak to all the teams involved, product/business teams, to teams that do the computer science end of things, to other linguists, to linguists that work on other teams. You end up, gathering often, 30, 40 different sign-offs. But eventually you rally around a design document. And then after that, there's implementation. There's different manners of implementing an Alexa under the hood. All of that will eventually give you the capability at some point to actually sit in front of your Fire TV at home, and I own one, to say, hey, Alexa, play, Throwback Thursday videos on TikTok, and it'll work, hopefully. But it's sort of that open-ended research question that becomes an implementation question, that eventually becomes a bug fixing question, that eventually, hopefully, becomes a highly monetizable experience. And you're involved, for better or for worse, all steps of the way.
Nice, super nice. And let's say, being a little bit specific of your role, how much would you say is qualitative and quantitative, like computational and a little bit more analytical, like 70-30? How will be this balance?
I'd say that any task I do, or almost every task I do, has a little bit of both. Even in sort of like the considering the customer end of things, we always have metrics. We always have different ways of measuring, in our large amount of traffic, is something working for most customers? Is it not working for most customers? What are defect rates, et cetera? So the quantitative is almost never out of your mind, and the qualitative is almost never out of your mind. Even looking at the metrics, if something says a failure, but it's a failure that sort of doesn't really affect the end-to-end experience, you have to remember that qualitative end of things. And I think that's the really cool thing about being a linguist in tech, is you have both of them in your mind at the same time, because there are many people that just work on the qualitative end of things. Those tend to be people more on the business end of things and the product end of things. And you also have people that do the quantitative stuff. And those are great roles in and of themselves. But you're sort of working in the middle of that as a linguist in tech, it can be challenging. It can be intimidating at times, but it's very linguistics in that you have to deal with both constantly.
And that's interesting, because usually when there is a quantitative problem, linguists are able to see the qualitative problem in that, right? Because we have like a large amount of data, but if there is a problem with that data, we can see like one sentence, and then we see, oh, that's the problem, and then we can fix it.
For sure.
Very interesting. And then I would like to jump to the question about portfolio, since we are talking about your role at Amazon. Because building a portfolio is very important nowadays, especially in the tech industry, to sell yourself, to show yourself off. So if one of our viewers is willing to have a similar job to yours, what type of projects would you recommend to add in their portfolio, so that they can make themselves competitive while applying for Amazon, for example, or Google, or etc.?
So I think there's a lot of deliverables, I think, that one could put on a resume. And I think a lot of them are impressive in their own ways. I think, and having been involved in some hiring processes, I think the two sorts of things that a lot of tech companies love to see is, number one, I think the ability to not only tackle hard linguistics questions in tech, but also take in roles and, take on responsibilities that are very like product manager in nature. Of, I am going to define my own problem. I'm going to look around and see like what can be improved. I will notice something that, a particular process that we do that's not incredibly efficient, and work it to make it more efficient, whether it be like an approval process, whether it be better collaboration with a particular team, making a meeting more efficient, things like that. In addition to linguistic mastery, I think it's the ability to be a efficient employee that is looking for other efficiencies. I think that is really, really critical. And a lot of it sandwiched into that is being a leader, whether or not you have a direct report. I think that shines through, particularly in Amazon interviews, but I imagine it's something similar over at Google and at Facebook and fill in the blank tech company.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's that. And then additionally, the raw dollars and cents in that myself, as well as my colleagues, can actually say what I did and worked on this project got this many more people using Alexa, this many more utterances uttered about this topic at Alexa, this many more dollars in signups happened from this feature. And that, that's, it's a business, and that's a really big part of us in being more monetizable. And I think the ability to say like, hey, I worked on project X and we got this much more business, this much more traffic, etc. That's really damn impressive, because you're no longer in the realm of, let's speak about the majesty of human language, which is, true, but kind of hard for people to concretize. You can concretize it in saying our understanding of the human language space got this much benefits. You can't really deny that from a business point of view of that being important. And that's a really hard skill, especially coming from academia. But, after a couple of years in working in tech, it does become second nature. And I see my colleagues, many of whom spent a lot longer in academia than I did, doing that on a very frequent basis.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So you're saying more kind of how you expose the projects that you've done, right? That's the key.
For sure. I mean, I would say that, and in your question of like, what's necessary for the portfolio and stuff like that, in collecting your portfolio, you want things that can lead to those outcomes. Like you want to be able to collect, some kind of experience, whether it's, at your role or whether it's, messing around on GitHub, whatever you're doing with your time, to say, look at this thing that I did and look at how it can provide like tangible business benefits. And, here is the proof.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then as a follow-up question, maybe from the portfolio matter, it is very important for a professional to keep studying, to keep learning, even if you already had a PhD. So NLP is always advancing. Like the NLP yesterday is not the same NLP today. So how do you keep up with the advancements in NLP? And what resources would you recommend for beginners to look for those advancements?
Yeah. So this is a question, I think, where it really depends sort of on someone's own, I guess, learning style, learning proclivities.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what I'd say is that, especially when one works in tech, but even in academia, I think it's really important to actually take a certain number of minutes of your week and very intentionally dedicate it to outside learning on your field in general. I do that. I spend about, say, between an hour and a half and 2 hours in a 5-day week, literally either reading articles, going on literally sometimes Reddit to see what like the latest innovations in LLM is. Very often, like Amazon has a bunch of like internal articles that come out. I spend time reading that. If anything, I could be doing more, but just try to take that time and learn the way you're comfortable with. I think that's really, really important. And you're right, that doesn't stop. It doesn't stop no matter how old you get or how much you progress in your career. Definitely take that time. And I think for sort of like people earlier in their career, I'd say that it depends on how focused your interests are, because it could be the case that your interests are not that focused yet, which is totally fine. In which case, I think a lot of that learning, you might want it to be sort of, what do I want to be doing, as opposed to like, how do I get there? Because that first question often has to be answered, not always, but often has to be answered before the second one. I mean, even like one of the first things I did in grad school, looking for, industry roles, was literally just looking at LinkedIn posts, which isn't really like, learning in the classical sense, but it gave me at least some idea of, what someone now like me would do in a day. So I guess it's a vague answer of just taking some time, but there's so many roles in the linguistics world, not just in tech, but in government, in advertising, and on all these different fields, that the nature of learning is going to be diverse.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, usually when people ask me, Ron, I would like to work with computational linguistics. What should I do? And I usually return the question like, what do you like?
Yeah.
Because then you can work with chatbots. You can be a little bit more a developer. You can be a manager. You can be annotator. You can be various things. And then I say, when you decide what you like, then you start, studying really hard to get there, as you said. Um, Great. Now I think we can focus a little bit more on the, let's say, career construction um, topic, which I would like to know now. Navigating a career that involves linguistics and technology can be very challenging, especially because, as you said, computational linguistics was not a job field back 10 years back, for example.
Hmm.
Um, so can you share any personal experiences or lessons from your career journey so far that might resonate with others on a similar path, or problems that you faced that you would like to prevent others to happen with them as well?
I mean, it's a very well taken question, but I just kind of laughed to myself that I'm already at the point where I would take that question, because it feels like just yesterday where I was kind of like sitting in front of the computer, really confused about what I'd be doing for the next decade. But I take the question. I'd say that in the scheme of things, there aren't that many people in the world that do linguistics. And I say do linguistics as expansively as possible. Like, you take all the roles together of people that do, the people are academic linguists, the people are people with background in linguistics that work in any industry, whether it's law, tech, advertising, anything like that. There aren't that many of us, which means that I think a lot of like the methods and pipelines that people have to get roles are not particularly standardized. So what that means is that community is incredibly important. Reaching out, and either whether it's via LinkedIn, whether it's via professional organizations like the LSA, that's tremendously important to us, because as sort of ultimately small group of people, we don't really have like the economics on our side to have really large sort of like mechanized pipelines. Like, think about for something like applying to law school, at least here in the United States. There's like, a large industry that prepares you for the LSAT, the standardized test to get into it. There's all these like, standardized methods of picking which law firm you go to. There's a whole portal you use for it, etc. There is, all these different rules and regulations. There's, of course, a bar association in America and all these countries around the world. That officialdom doesn't really exist, and that leaves us, and I say leave not necessarily a negative, but it means that there's a lot more to gain in terms of finding out about individual experience, because that large standardized place doesn't really exist. So what I would say is continuously reach out to folks, blind message people if you need to. And I have found that the community of professional linguists is one of the friendliest of, I would say, any professional group of people that I have heard of or been a part of. I, in my earlier lookings for roles, have sort of kind of just blind message people like, hey, what you do looks really interesting. Tell me a little bit about, how you got to where you are. And I would get a response. And even if you don't, no harm, no foul. So I would say is that keep trying to engage with folks, because it tends to be that, and I'll use this in quotes, like people like me, as in people who have had that first role, had that second role, are in many cases like more than happy to get back to people, largely because like we're all, and I mean this like, as a compliment, we're all a little weird, we're all like on our own little like linguistics world. We all have like this like very funny little thing in common that we really love this discipline. And that provides a camaraderie, I have found.
Great. Yeah, I agree with you. I have talked with many linguists like blindly, and they were very friendly. And most of the guests that I have here, I never spoke to them. So I've never spoken to them. So, and they answer very nicely. For example, you, I never spoke to you, and then you accepted gladly to come. So make your networking. That's all we're saying.
100,
Um,
100%. And I will say, like, the benefit goes both ways, where, if you want to find out something going on up here at Amazon, you know who to contact. If there's anything that I might see, oh, wow, Joao Victor's doing something super cool, I will not be shy, and like those kind of connections, as they multiply and as like your network increases, it really is like such a huge tangible benefit.
mhm. And as soon as you start the conversation, it builds a channel for exchange. As you said, you can ask me things, I can ask you things, and we can. There is a saying in Portuguese like trocar figurinhas would be like exchange stickers, because then we exchange information. Uh,
Very
okay.
cool. And also, you make me very jealous because I wish I spoke Portuguese. But when I have time to learn another language, it will probably be Portuguese.
Oh, that's
Because
nice.
absolutely, I mean, look, I love Romance languages with nasals. That's why I learned French in high school. So, you know what? Portuguese, I'm coming for you.
Oh, good. Let me know if you want to practice together.
Oh,
Um,
100%.
and now, as we said previously, NLP is advancing in a very rapid movement. Hopefully, onwards, not backwards, right? Forward, hopefully forward, not backwards. Um, but what skills and competencies do you believe will be most valuable for linguists who wants to thrive in the NLP and artificial intelligence? And do you think are any specific areas within linguistics uh, that will offer more promising career opportunities in the coming years?
So, I think this is a thing where I'll give my view on things that I very much welcome disagreement for those who
Mm-hmm.
listen, but I think I'll come at it from a particular viewpoint. I'd say on 2 points. Number one, I think what's hot right now on the tech side of things is LLMs, large language models. I think a lot of us have seen ChatGPT explode culturally. I just used it to help write some code earlier today. It's everywhere. So I think even reading up a little bit on LLMs, spending, a couple of hours on it, I think would be really, really helpful, because in many cases, that's where NLP is kind of shifting. So I would say, and it might be a very dated answer if someone's listening to this in a couple of years, but here in 2023, I would say get some background on LLMs. I think neural networks for certain use cases will probably be around for a little bit of a while as well. So that knowledge I think is great. Not even necessarily, programming either, but a basic architecture of both. But in terms of sort of like the linguistics skills, I would say that in terms of the major subfields, the ones that I use on a daily basis, I would say semantics is probably number one, followed by mixture of phonetics, phonology, followed by sociolinguistics.
Can I ask you
Yeah,
something from
of
that?
course.
When you say phonetics, does it cover segmental, super segmental, or only segmental phonetics?
The answer to your either or is yes. So both.
Okay, good.
So you will definitely get it's a subseg like the segmental stuff. Absolutely, that for the dialectology that we have to do for Alexa, like I think that's very clear. But for super segmental stuff, 100%. Like for instance, like question intonation is a really really big issue cross linguistically. As you're internationalizing whatever voice product you have, be it Alexa, be it Cortana, etc. Question intonation is really hard because sometimes word order doesn't change, as we both know. So, intonation really, really matters. I think, in particular, we get issues with some declaratives very, very frequently. And I think, particularly, a lot of super segmental stuff is very difficult to describe to those that are, CS in background. So I think those that have done research on super segmental stuff that are able to explain it really can have a superstar status if they market themselves right. Which, based on the question, Joao Victor, I'm not sure if that's you. If that is, that's amazing.
I know a little bit about prosody.
Okay.
I work. I'm doing a master's, and the lab that I'm in, they basically work with prosody. I'm not working with it,
Okay.
but I know the basics.
So yeah, I mean, as NLP gets more and more complicated, the super segmental stuff is sort of like the next. It could be, I think, a future area of very, very hot research. I think that in gesture. There's a lot of gestural linguistic stuff that is, I think, not working well generally in Alexa and a lot of other voice products because they tend to start integrating visual cues. And we are really not at the point yet where we can have those super segmental, those visual cues.
Yeah.
So any visual cue linguists out there, get excited. We want you.
Yeah, we don't have much multimodal like research yet. We have some, but not enough. Um, and now, as my final question, um, I think now there is a kind of a boost of linguists interested in combining linguistics and tech, mainly because it's a very, let's say, uh, the profit from that is very good for linguists, and it
Sure.
is something outside academia because it's another alternative for those who don't want to teach or to do research.
Yeah.
So, what advice would you give to them? Um, and what would you say, like words of encouragement to them? And if possible, try to focus on those who are just starting out. I want to do computational linguistics now.
So I want to see if I can clarify the question. Are you asking sort of like in general those what can what's guidance for those that are kind of just starting out in computational linguistics, but is it more about sort of like the profit end of things?
No, the first part, like
Okay,
some kind
got
of
it.
guidance, directions, orientation.
Got it. 'Cause I get questions about both, but I'll say that the general first thing I would say, and actually the two things relate, is why do you actually want to do it, right? So basically, I've spoken to some people that really are fascinated and really interested in the work that Google Home or an Alexa does. They're thrilled about it, and they have a lot of fun here, and that's incredible. And I love working with such people, and that is the vast majority of the people I work with. I would say that there are a lot of people that treat the role sort of as like, I would rather do academia, but I'm here. Or I'm interested in having a stable paying job, but, this is not really what I'm interested in, stuff like that. And for that, I would say is that it really tends to be this is not a role where if you weren't interested in it, that you could kind of get by. I would say the first thing is is establish an actual interest in it. And I think the best way to do that is talking to someone who's a linguist in tech. I think that's number one, because you don't have to be interested in this. Super fine not to be. Like, we're like the linguists that work for voice assistants are our own little field within a field, and it's totally fine if you're not one of us in that regard. That's great. I think beyond that, I think the question, if you are interested, is largely big or small, as well as public or private. So there are some really big tech giants that do this. So I've been mentioning Alexa, Google, Facebook, as well. Excuse me, Meta. And that is a very different world than some of the smaller places that do NLP. And I worked at such a place in my previous role. It's very different. The pace is very different. In some ways, one is more difficult than the other. And I think it's pretty important to know that in your application. Once you know sort of big or small, I'd also think a little bit, and this is critical for the US, and I'm actually interested to see how it would translate to Brazil and other nations, is public or private. Because there's a lot of government roles that involve NLP, where there's security clearances involved. It's helpful to learn what the US government would call critical languages, languages that are spoken often by, what they view to be enemies of the state. That's a different world, a world that I worked in tangentially. That's another form. I think once you can answer those questions, I think then you are ready to really dive in a very real way into the application process. And what I would say is that the interview processes are quite particular, and when the jobs open up is quite particular. There's sort of a boom and bust, where suddenly in 1 year there's a bunch of openings, and the next year there's very few openings.
Ezra, are you there? You're kind of frozen. Yes, you are.
I'm back. Nice. Hope you caught the end of that, but that's sort of, I think, the questions to be asked before kind of diving in. But I think to finish there, I think once you sort of know, like, are you interested, big or small, public, private, I think then is kind of the time to reach out to someone like me, someone who's a language and tech, hopefully in your network, hopefully you know them. I can kind of give you the 411 in a particular place.
Yeah, I agree with you. Mainly regarding the size of the company.
Yeah.
Not exactly the size will impact your daily activities. It will impact, for example, who you are going to report to, how you're going to do it, how much time do you have to do something. So I think it's very, and also the policies, the company policies will be very different depending on the size.
Yeah.
Regarding, for example, PTO, or regarding, medical leave, benefits as well. So
of course.
It really depends on that. And the second thing you said about public or private, here in Brazil, we don't have much this problem because there aren't much jobs for linguists in the public side of things. Mainly we have like reviewers, basically, that when they ask for linguistic background. And I was talking to an American friend that I have. I saw on LinkedIn a post for the FBI.
Yeah.
And they were asking for linguists. And I don't know if you know that, but my master's in forensic linguistics.
Oh.
And
wow.
I was like, oh my God, that's the perfect job for me. But then they asked to be an American citizen. So I was like, oh gosh, I can't do it. And here in Brazil, we don't have this kind of job. I think we have like our intelligence, force, etc. But they don't ask, or they don't open jobs for linguists in any kind, forensics or not. So that's sad, because I think we can help a lot, not only in the forensics part, but in other spheres as well, in other situations. But we haven't seen that yet here in Brazil.
Right. I think, pros and cons. I feel like because of the different nature of the American military, I feel like you have that in the US, you don't have that in Brazil. On the other hand, if you want to do like language preservation work, I feel like there's stuff in Brazil you can do that you can't do almost anywhere else. So just depends.
Yeah, it depends. So that's it for today, Ezra. Thank you very much. I learned a lot. I'm sure that people who are watching uh, learned as well. So thank you again for all the tips that you gave and all the guidance that you gave us today.
For sure. And thank you so much. I'm really glad you're doing this.
Thank you. So folks, thank you very much for watching. Ezra, again, thank you for coming. And let's see. Let's wait for the next episode. And let me know what you think about Ezra and his comments in the comments. Okay? Thank you. Bye bye.